Hello everyone, and welcome to Mayworks Ottawa 2019, and I'll just pass it over to Greg from Octopus Books.
Thank you. Hi, thanks so much for coming. Of course, we have here Dylan Penner, who's the grandson of the editor of the book, Norman Penner, and Christo as well. They're going to talk about the book in a moment. I don't know anything about it, so I'll leave it to them. I just want to have a couple things to say. One of which is it's part of Mayworks Ottawa, and it's a long list of activities going on, and you can find some flyers on the table over there. And additionally, these events are made possible by the sale of books, so we'd really appreciate it if you took a look at the table. We've got copies of this and also one of Christo's books. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. And just want to acknowledge that we're on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. As Greg mentioned, my name is Dylan Penner, and I am a member of the Mayworks Ottawa organizing committee. This is the second year of reviving Mayworks Ottawa. It was active a little while back, and we're happy to be continuing this tradition, and very special thanks to Octopus for co-sponsoring this event. And Mayworks is a festival of working class culture that is rooted in an understanding that workers share a common struggle as a class against capitalism, and the arts are an important part of that struggle and an important part of advancing that work. And as many of you know, May 1st, International Workers' Day, is on Wednesday, and it's the day when workers of the world take to the streets in major cities around the world to expose the impacts of capitalism and to demand justice and dignity for all. And so Mayworks Ottawa is marking this day with the program that Greg referenced, with a range of different activities that is encouraging communities in struggle to express their experiences of working class struggle through the arts. And this year in particular, we're also commemorating the centenary of the Winnipeg General Strike, which is why it's great that we're able to have this event in particular as part of the program this year. And the Winnipeg General Strike was really the largest and most influential strike in Canadian history, and we're going to get into a little bit of the how and why of that in a moment. So inspired by that, the theme of Mayworks Ottawa this year is Toppling the System, 100 Years of Working Class Resistance in the Arts. And before I introduce our guest, I just want to thank a number of organizations whose generous support has made this year's Mayworks possible. That includes the Canadian Union of Public Employees, OPSU, PSAC National Capital Region, the IWW General Defense Committee of Ottawa-Outaouais, Ottawa QP District Council, Ottawa District Labour Council, Workers' History Museum, and Solidarity Ottawa. And so it's also, I think, really important to recognize that today is the annual Day of Mourning. It's a commemoration every year of workers who have died on the job and in the struggle. And there were people who were killed during the 1919 strike. And today we're here talking about a book that takes a close look at the Winnipeg General Strike and its impacts. Winnipeg 1919, The Strikers' Own History of the General Strike, by the Winnipeg Defense Committee and edited by Norman Penner. And it's a special significance to me since, as Greg noted, the book was edited by my late grandfather, Norman, and so I grew up hearing about this book, how it came about, and how it came to be that my grandfather found out that there was just this trove of archival materials that had just been sitting around and not much had happened with it. So it was really a highlight of the importance of us documenting our struggles, because we can't always count on others to do that for us. So today we're joined by Christo who's forward in the new centenary edition of the book, focuses on what lessons we can learn from the strike for today. And obviously we've got a lot of struggles that we're in the midst of, and so there's quite a few highlights and lessons that are quite relevant for today. And Christo is an adjunct professor in Canadian political and labor history. His research deals primarily with Canadian labor leftist history, specifically Pierre Trudeau's relationship with Canada's economic and social democratic left, and also focusing on the broader history of Canadian workers, socialists, radical Christians, and liberal intellectuals. So in terms of the format today, we're going to have a bit of a conversation about the contents of the book and the significance of the strike, and we're hoping to engage in conversation with all of you here as well about that as well. So to start off, Christo, I'm hoping you can paint a bit of a picture and talk about the context. What conditions led to the strike?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things actually. Specific to Winnipeg is that the strike really sort of happened at this time of great expansion. Winnipeg, like a lot of Western towns, even a generation before this, were quite small. You know, if you go back to the start of Confederation, cities like St. John, New Brunswick, and Halifax, Nova Scotia were among the country's largest. And now, with anybody here from the Maritimes, because that's where I'm from, those cities are considered small by Ontario standards. Toronto suburbs dwarf them in size, right? Or make them, are so much larger. Western provinces at the time were rapidly expanding, due in large part to the dispossession of land from Indigenous people. And these cities were thus epicenters of class conflict and of growing disparity. Winnipeg perhaps more than the others. Towns like Calgary and Edmonton really caught up, once the oil boom happened. But Edmonton situated along the north-south lines that came up through the American Midwest, and also being kind of the Western Canadian rail hub, made it a town where there was a large class of working people, both British and non-British, but also this kind of growing economic elite situated within, whether it's the grain industry or the rail industry or what have you, that was becoming very wealthy very quickly. And the city became an epicenter for that conflict. And of course, the general concerns of the time, because the Winnipeg General Strike, and this is one of the things I noted in the book, and one of the debates actually that happened when the strike was first being written about during the 1970s by historians was, was it a Western Canadian phenomenon, or was it part of a global capitalist or global anti-capitalist revolt? And I take the latter point of view, which is that this is happening at a time where capital is really turning the screws to labor still. Modern trade unionism had yet to really emerge. We're still largely within a craft model. The Trades and Labor Congress is still kind of the only major organization in town for Canada. The AFL in the United States. These are relatively exclusive and narrow and conservative trade unions. And after World War I, across Canada, but also in the United States and in Britain and through much of the developed world, there was, the economic crisis, the decline in employment, because in addition to the fact that the war industries have shut down, you have hundreds of thousands of men in all these countries returning back from the war, now added to the unemployment rules. It's just a context for class conflict. And the limitations of our social assistance systems aside, nothing existed back then. Nothing existed to mitigate workers' experiences of unemployment, soldiers coming back from wars, both with physical injuries, but also with injuries that we would now call PTSD, that they would call shell shock, were being untreated or undiagnosed. All of these kind of conflicts were adding up to a tinderbox in cities like Winnipeg, but not just Winnipeg. Winnipeg is the biggest example in Canada, but what makes the Winnipeg General Strike special in part is because it wasn't the only one. There was a general strike in Amherst, Nova Scotia, for instance, and there were large strikes, maybe not general strikes, but there were large strikes in cities all across Canada. The West did seem to be a bit more militant, but as Greg Keeley has noted, that militancy was not so much regional, but was national. One of the arguments again being made is that World War I was the first sort of national event in Canada. Canada being a relatively young country since Confederation, highly regionalized, and the technological limitations meant that communication and travel were actually quite slow. But as World War I happened, the ability to move people and information across the country improved, and the war did create this shared experience within Canada, even if that experience was to resist the wars in places like Quebec, it did create this national event, which helped to, at least hypothetically, create a kind of national working class conscience, which started to emerge during the strike and after the strike.
Yeah. And so the conditions were there, and that's
Yeah.
one thing, but how did organizers translate those conditions, seize on those conditions to actually get from there to organizing a general strike?
Well, it was a mixture of, they were forced into the strike in some ways because capital had such a hold over Winnipeg. Winnipeg being a relatively new city that was built up, and a lot of the credit supposedly went to these moguls of industry who took this prairie space, again, stolen from Indigenous people, and in a generation or two built up this one of Canada's largest cities. Winnipeg would, for a brief time, probably be Canada's third or fourth largest city before being eclipsed by places like Calgary and Edmonton and what have you. But the reality is that there was a real reluctance to actually recognize workers. There were very few formalized systems of industrial relations at the time. There were some exceptions. On the railways, for instance, there were, in the early 1910s, there were systems in place to try to deal with the fact that employers would negotiate. But outside of railways, there really wasn't anything forcing an employer to negotiate. There was no labor boards that were just dealing with employers that would have a collective association of workers, and they would just ignore them until they, of course, ran out of money. And you're not really paying dues if you're not collecting a collective agreement. You're not. So there was that ability there to do that. So there was a lot of pressure being put on the workers, and fundamentally, what the strike started as was a discontent with employers not recognizing workers' rights as unions. Wasn't so much over a particular issue of wages or health and safety or anything of that sort. It was really largely about two relatively established unions, one of them the metal workers, whose employer said, if you try to affiliate with any larger organizations, we will not recognize you. Which is to say that they might recognize them as a sort of quasi-company union or as an isolated local association, which of course would lack very little muscle in any kind of serious negotiation. And so the workers in that city organized around the fact that they were fighting for things like the right, the freedom of association, the right to have the workers' bargaining unit of their choice recognized, and that's where it kind of grew. So the strike starts really through a series of debates and negotiations and speeches and rallies held in the city in the months before, and it really manifests when all of the unionized workers in the city, by local, have a kind of vote. And this book notes it, the really good graphic history of the Winnipeg General Strike, the Graphic History Collective. I know I think there are copies here of that. Kind of shows a little graphic table of all the various locals in the town, who voted for, who voted against. And that's how it started. They basically organized a plebiscite of trade unionists in the city. They had a vote, and that was it. They were going on a general strike. And the vast majority of workers supported it. Police trade unionists supported it. Even in most locals, it was something like 98, 99, 95% of the workers in locals supported it. So was there unanimity? No, but there was effectively consensus to support the strike, and that's how it kind of largely kicked off. It was still centered in the traditional, relatively exclusive craft unions. Yeah.
And so, taking a bigger picture and looking at a bit of the legacy as well, what are some of the key things, in addition to what you've mentioned, to know about the significance of the strike?
Well, there's really three things, and I talk about this in the introduction. One is that while the strike started as rooted in the experiences and motivations and organization of traditional trade unionists, like skilled craftsmen, things like that. The reality is that the strike would encompass most of the city's working class. So that's what made it special. It started as through the kind of infrastructure of Winnipeg's trade union, for lack of a better term, bureaucracy of the city's trade unionists. but it would quickly come to include kind of all workers, whether or not they were TLC unions or not, or whether they were in bargaining units or not. And depending on some of the statistics you've seen, the strike at its height was more non-union workers than union workers. It was about 50-50 in a sense, because most of the city's working class, far less than today, was unionized, because there was no public sector unions. Most working men, the masses of working people were not unionized. The unions were really a preserve of a very narrow part of working people. You were very fortunate to be in one. And our union density in Canada today hovers, depending on the province and place, I don't know, 30% or so, 32. Some provinces it's closer to 40, some it's less. At the time, Canada's union density was below 10, right? So the reality is that this was it was special because it included people outside of that. Another reason it was special, and this isn't to whitewash it, and there'll be a lot of discussions as we approach the centenary about race in the Winnipeg General Strike, but it was a relative time of solidarity between ethnic groups, if only between various groups of European Canadians. Before the strike and even after the strike to a degree, there was a kind of sharp divide between British Canadians, the real Canadians, old stock Canadians, if you will, and the growing population of European Canadians, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe, especially whether it's from Russia, whether it's Jewish populations, or the general population of Slavic people, for instance. There was a real divide there, and there was a sense that those latter workers were lowering the standards of work for the native British workers. There was a sense that those workers were often communist radicals. They were often foreign agents. They were often, just dangerous people, criminals. That they were the cause. Their personal failings were the causes of slum conditions in North Winnipeg, or that because they were quote unquote dirty foreigners, that it was their fault that TB, tuberculosis, was rampant in certain pockets of Winnipeg. When of course the answer was poor housing and poverty and lack of public health and what have you. That these things really divided workers. And after the war, there was a feeling that it would happen again. That British Canadians, who were most of Canada's people who served in the war, were British Canadians, would come back and would have conflicts with Winnipeg's rather large, relative to the rest of Canada, population of non-British Europeans. And what ended up happening was that there was a kind of solidarity between these two broad camps, between English Canadians and between European Canadians, from Southern and Eastern Europe, in a way no one expected. And this is in part, I think, because the strike went beyond the formal unions. Because in addition to the formal unions being very exclusive, including few women, including a very small amount of people generally, they were largely dominated by Anglo-Canadians, like by British Canadians, because they were the unions of relatively kind of skilled and exclusive workers. A lot of immigrants often, even if they had the skills, of course, as we know today, often don't find work relative to their skill sets, and they're often relegated to lower paid and more, dangerous jobs, jobs that are classified as quote-unquote unskilled, and that was much the case in Winnipeg. So, this building beyond the trade union borders and building beyond the ethnic borders, again, for all the complications, this is, I don't mean to oversimplify here, was something very special. And that's what I think has struck a lot of terror within capital. And again, the third thing is that this was a revolt against capitalism. There's going to be a lot of whitewashing of the strike, I think, from a lot of unions that maybe don't want to make it about fairness or about collective bargaining, and that's important. But it really was a revolt against capitalism. And it wasn't necessarily that everyone was Marxist-Leninist. In fact, the average person there would probably be what you would call a social democrat or a democratic socialist, in terms of the average participant in the strike, and much of the leadership. But the reality was that this was a revolt against capitalism, either in total or certainly as it manifested in the pre-World War II variety, which is the gross inequality, the lack of social assistance, very few rights for unions. And this is extremely important, and that ties into the fact, and again, this was a key debate historiographically, was that the strike was part of a national and international movement of workers. It's connected, even if indirectly, to what was happening in the Soviet Union. It's connected to general strikes in Seattle. It's connected to workers' revolts in Germany and in France and in Britain. It's connected on the political scene to the rise of the Labour Party, the rise of Labour parties and democratic socialist parties and communist parties in Canada and beyond. And so that's really kind of what makes it significant. It's a strike, but it's also a deeply political movement. And I think it's a lesson for us in a sense that often we dichotomize, well, it's either the NDP or it's on the streets activism. What the general strikers would say, well, for most of them would say it's probably work within your Democratic Socialist Party, but also general strike from time to time. Yeah.
And it seems at the time the capitalists agreed with an interpretation that it was a revolt against capitalism, because one significant development was the formation of what was called the Committee of 1000. Could you talk a little bit about what that was and its role in the open class war nature of the struggle at the time?
For sure. The Committee of 1000 was a relatively very secretive group of Winnipeg businessmen, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, the elite of the city, the South Winnipeg folks that dominated the city's political and economic and cultural institutions before the strike. And they effectively took over the city. The city's police were fired. The city's police were fired because they supported the strikers. What they called specials, but what you would call hired goons, effectively scab police officers, were given power. These committees were basically empowered to create police. These non-official police arrested strikers. They arrested strike leaders. This committee also created trials and were basically empowered itself to have legal trials where people went to jail on officially recognized terms. And in a sense, it was the city ceding civil authority to a group of unelected capitalists. And this was accepted by the RCMP, not called the RCMP yet. I still think it was the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. The name would change around this time, but basically the RCMP and the federal government and the provincial government at the time were all sort of in unison with this happening. So capital was able to kind of effectively organize in that way to counter the strike. So what they were able to do that by arresting strike leaders, while they were also able to make some inroads by attacking the ethnicity of some of the strikers. Again, pretty much the entirety of the leadership were British Canadians. Many of them born in Canada or immigrants from Scotland or England or Ireland or what have you. There is as pure a Canadian in terms of the racial politics of the day as you could get, but the Committee of 1000 was able to make the note that so many of these of the strikers are foreigners, they're aliens, and we shouldn't trust them, that this is related to Bolshevism and what have you. When again, there's very little evidence of that, of any direct connections, although there was inspiration being drawn. Lenin's works weren't translated yet, right? Like, to put that in perspective, people couldn't read Lenin yet. Lenin's works weren't in English by in any significance. It's certainly not the writings that were coming out of the actual Soviet Union. The reality was that they were really effective in doing that, and it was this group of non-elected officials, capital, being able to really tie itself into and gain legitimacy from the kind of federal government, the provincial government, and the federal government's police service, which again, whose history is, the RCMP's history is the crushing of workers' dissent and the control of indigenous people, right? Like, it's rooted in that, right? And so there's a distinction even between law enforcement, because local law enforcement largely supported the strikers and didn't go on strike. They were willing to. The strikers asked them not to help keep civil order, but because they were not on the side of capital explicitly, they were removed from their positions. So they were largely effective in these moves, and they did things like for instance, changing the criminal code to make deportation easier. At the time, you had Canada had birthright citizenship, but there were many immigrants from non-British Isles countries, and they were classified as aliens, and they were relatively easy to deport. But during the strike, it was made even easier. So it made it so that the strikers who were not of British origin or Canadian birth were put at very real risk of being deported, and many of them to countries that would be antagonistic to trade unionists or anybody associated with anything that of the left in much of Eastern Europe at the time. So it was a very scary time, and they were effective. There's a book called When the State Trembled. It covers the history of the Committee of 1000 and does a really good job of exploring how this group defeated the strike, more or less, at least in the immediate term.
And so you've touched a fair bit on the tactics used by the capitalists at the time of racism and anti-immigrant sentiment to try and divide the strike, and obviously we're seeing a lot of a rising tide of racism and white supremacy and anti-immigrant sentiment now that's being used to divide the working class too. So could you talk a little bit about in relation to those tactics that were used to try and break the strike, and the use of white supremacy and racism today to attack workers and the 99%, and what lessons can be drawn from the experience of the strike that in relation to that we can apply today?
No, certainly. And again, when we talk about race in the strike, there's been not enough work done about the role of Indigenous people or lack thereof in the event. There's limited work done on how relatively small communities of, say, Chinese workers in Winnipeg at the time responded. It's largely been done through the lens of relations between various white populations, right? And I don't want to downplay those distinctions, of course, because they're very real, and not everyone identified as the concept of whiteness as we understand it today is very different than it was in the 1900s or the early 1900s. So there's a lot more to be said here, and I'm not an expert on those things, but in general, they were able to exploit it because there were both cultural and legal differences. The cultural differences between this idea of, British Canadians standing for the good British institutions, the idea of parliamentary democracy, British rule of law, things like this, all of which were supposedly being subverted by the strikers whose actions were trying to take over the city, its democratically elected institutions, and in so doing, were kind of tearing up centuries of British rule. Like, they're spitting on the Magna Carta, if you will, as they do this. And again, a lot of these people were British Canadians, and probably proudly so. But because some of the strikers in the rank and file of the strike were non-British, that was something of an effective tactic. And another reason was the different legal statuses between people. The legal statuses between people really mattered. And if you, at the time, Canadian citizenship didn't exist, you were a subject of the British Empire and later the Commonwealth. Canadian citizenship didn't exist till 1947, I believe. Mackenzie King was the first Canadian. Before that, we were all just subjects of the Empire or the Commonwealth. But if you were not born in a British Isles country, or you were not born in Canada, you had to become naturalized as a citizen, and there were large segments of the population that didn't have that status. Now, it didn't necessarily prevent them from working, but it meant that they often lacked things like the right to vote, and they were much more easily deported. And not just deported for crimes. You could be deported at the time for just being unemployed. I mentioned this briefly in the book. It's mentioned in a lot of stories that Mike Sokolovsky was one of the only person directly killed during the strike. And he basically doesn't get a grave. He basically gets dug into the ground. Recently, one's been built in Winnipeg by local fundraising. They've built this beautiful memorial to him and to the strike. But at the time, he wasn't claimed. The reason he wasn't claimed, because we know he had a wife and kids, is because if that woman went, they would have probably deported her, because she's a single woman. Obviously, she probably can't support herself, given the political and economic context of the time. They would have deported her because she would have become a ward of the state or a charge of the state. So in a sense, all of these legal distinctions divided workers. So it's cultural and religious to a certain degree, where you have Jewish versus Christian, or Protestant versus Catholic, or Protestant versus Orthodox, or what have you. But the reality is that there was both. And again, as I noted before, the fact that the unions themselves weren't kind of as multi-ethnic as the working class was, or even approaching it. Of course, in Canada, we know that our unions are often whiter than some of the general populations are in some cases, because newer Canadians, for a variety of reasons, have lower unionization rates. The reality is, at this time, the distinctions were very clear. So you would add up how the unions are structured in their membership, how the legal systems are structured, and how the cultural systems are structured, and we can see similar things today. We see that our unions could be more diverse, especially in certain communities. Unions offer a lot of benefits, but if the membership are disproportionately white in certain unions in certain communities, that does create an inability to build this kind of cross-racial, cross-religious, cross-cultural alliance, cross-linguistic alliance. In Canada, we do have a lot of legal distinctions still. We have temporary foreign workers, through the direct TFW program. We also have, farm workers that work in southern Ontario, who effectively come here, in some cases every summer, but never have any chance of winning, citizenship. We have a whole host of domestic workers who build lives here and aren't able to find work. And in a sense, it's a smaller portion of the population, because Canada, doesn't have, the wave of immigration as it did in the early 1900s as a proportion of the population. But it is to say that those distinctions still exist, and it means that there's always this tension between the full status worker, the full Canadian worker, and these people who, through a patchwork of programs, have very limited rights as workers, and often that makes it impossible for them to unionize, or makes it very difficult for them to even leave employers, because they're sort of ensconced with a particular employer relationship, which effectively makes them an indentured servant in some ways. And as long as these legal distinctions exist, it really creates this. And of course, the cultural distinctions are obviously poignant. This idea that immigrants are taking people's jobs. If you look at recent polling from ECOS, troubling as it is, it says that every single political party in the country, except the NDP, believes that we need less non-white immigrants and more than more non-white immigrants. The New Democrats, actually about a quarter of New Democrats, have that kind of pro-white supremacy position, but it's the only party that has more people that would say Canada now needs to become more diverse. So the Greens, the Liberals, and the Conservatives, supporters of those parties, want Canada to have a whiter immigration policy. Conservatives far outstrip the other two in terms of the proportions, but that's the case. And every region in this country, except the Maritimes, wants Canada to have less racialized immigrants. So these are real tensions we have to deal with. And I don't strictly know what the answer is, but I think that building diverse unions and movements like the Fight for 15 are part of it. Because what the Fight for 15 has done, in a sense, is, again, based in a lot of the structures of unions. Unions have given funding and have given staff support and have given logistical support, often give office space, a lot of the things that help movements get off the ground, to things like the Fight for 15. So it's not purely grassroots. But what it's done is it's largely benefited non-unionized workers. Of course, we know there are some unionized workers that weren't making $15 or $14 an hour, but the largest benefit went to non-unionized workers in traditionally non-unionized sectors. So that's a movement that's effectively combined trade unionist values, with promoting greater workplace rights even outside the collective bargaining metric. And as we know, in both Canada and the United States, people who work minimum wage are disproportionately likely to be women and racialized, right? So when you push for basic labor improvements like that, you diversify, if not the labor movement, the capital L, capital M labor movement, you diversify like the working class movement. And I think that's at least something of a lesson we can learn. Yeah.
Definitely. And for many reasons, the general strike, in addition to what we've talked about so far with the very real impacts, there are real symbolic impacts as well. And one of the iconic images is that tipping of the streetcar that was captured in that photo, which was also the inspiration for the poster for Mayworks this year. But not everyone knows that the streetcar was operated by a scab, by a strike breaker. And you know, in the context of the working class anger you're talking about, it really seems to have led to how that unfolded. What's your take on the significance of that context and what happened that led to that photo?
Well, I mean, I think it adds a lot of the rationale. The rationale, frankly, is like you're crossing a picket line. You shouldn't cross picket lines. And the workers responded, I think, proportionately, given the context, given the violence that it was erupting and that would erupt even further after that incident and during that incident. In terms of what it means for us today, I think it's important to realize that, you know, while certain things change, there are certain principles that we have as red lines. There was in Newfoundland right now. Recently there was a long-running labor dispute and lockout of workers, I believe affiliated with Unifor, and there was a whole debate about should we call out the scabs and shouldn't we? And a lot of people, normally progressive, felt uncomfortable with the outing of scabs. But I think that there are certain universal values in that we shouldn't tolerate scab labor and we should keep with that. So while I think as a movement need to be reflective, I think there are certain concepts, complicated as they can be, because one of the complications in that Newfoundland one is that these scabs were perhaps more diverse in terms of gender and race than the actual unionized workers. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, workers should be able and should be unflinching in their desire to uphold the picket line. And again, it shows that this is still a dangerous act. You know, people often associate, if not the value of unions, you'll often hear people say, of course, unions were great back then, but now they're not useful. But of course, they were saying that in the 1890s about unions from the 1870s, right? They've always said that, they'll always say that. But often people will associate, you know, physical class conflict with the past. But it was just, what was it, last week, the week before, that a PC MPP ran over a picketer in Ajax, and it was during just before the provincial election last year, where an OPSU striker, I believe they were locked out actually, but an OPSU picketer was hit by a car in Barrie. I know that the OFL Secretary Treasurer was on the site as it happened. She was recording it, and during the U of T and York strikes, people were hit by cars, and so I think it does show that, like, there's still this element we have to talk about here, which is that, like, labor activism is not a safe thing. Not only is it potentially damaging to people's livelihoods because employers will retaliate legally and illegally against workers, but that there's still physical dangers in this. It's still a conflict. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And in relation to that, given, you know, in addition to the driving techniques of certain ministers and their assistants in the Ford government, we're also seeing this government here in Ontario slashing and burning pretty much everything they can, and as a result of that, more people now are talking about a need for a general strike here and now. But what can we learn from Winnipeg 1919 about how you actually go about organizing one in our current context?
Yeah, well, there's a few things that are different, right? You know, again, we have new tools now that allow for different organizations. So any kind of comparisons would have to differ. The role of social media, the positive and the detriments of social media, of course, as well. All of these things play a role. One thing is that there's a student movement that didn't really exist back then. You know, there were, of course, universities back then, but they were, again, very small, often exclusive, not necessarily conservative. A lot of political leftists came from relatively educated backgrounds, but there was no broad mass student movement like there is today in places like Ottawa and Toronto and Kingston and all across this province. So there are differences, but I would say that one thing is that the Winnipeg General Strike taught us that the initial seeds have to come from the formalized labor structures. That doesn't necessarily just mean the unions, but it would mean things like labor councils. It would mean things like other forms of groups, because the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Congress Council was largely the organizing nexus for this, and it included not all of the city's unions, but most of the city's unions. Because in the early 1900s, most of Canada's largest unions were in the Trades and Labor Congress. And the only massive union not in it for most of that time was the Brotherhood of Railway Employees, the Canadian Brotherhood of Railway Employees. But during this brief 18 to 1921 period, they were in the TLC. Every major union in Canada effectively was in that body. So you need to organize through those structures first. I think you need to get as much of a consensus as you can from organized labor to call a general strike. And I think another factor is that it has to include the interests and the participation of non-unionized workers. So what you're fighting for isn't just strictly in relation to formal collective bargaining, but for basic things, whether that's fighting for basic statutory labor standards like the $15 minimum wage, more vacation time, you know, things like that. It could also be fighting against cuts or for social programs that people need, whether it's dental care or things like that. Because the reality is that as a young person myself, and who's been in unions and currently isn't in one, but I have no workplace pension. I have dental benefits from my wife's unionized position, but many young people don't have health and dental benefits. That in effect, fighting for these things as part of a general strike or a general movement and building those things not into formalized collective agreements, but into our systems of universal social programs are helpful. A couple risks, though, is that I think people need to realize the risks of a general strike, right? A lot of people lost their jobs. And if you're going to call wildcat strikes, there needs to be reckoning with the legal consequences. How would unions resist the fine? Are labor leaders willing to go to jail? Jean-Claude Parot went to jail in 1979 when Pierre Trudeau, locked him up, right? But no, well, Justin Trudeau would not hesitate to lock, if it came to that. They prefer fines now to locking workers up, because locking a union leader up makes him or her a martyr. But now they just prefer fining. But what if, say, CUPW just refuses to pay the fine if they go on a general strike? Or what if CUPE, or what if, you know, any union, public or private sector, chooses to do that? What happens then? What happens to non-unionized workers who want to participate in the strike, yet, you know, they just end up getting fired because none of the other people in their workplace join them? You know, what happens to these groups? I think the call for a general strike, not to be conservative or anything, you know, small c conservative, it has to be done with all of this in mind. And if you're going to call one, you have to have the best expectations that it'll be successful. Because otherwise, you're just going to create disenchantment within the working class community. Because if you call one and it fails, then the next time, even 10 years later perhaps, then people will be like, yeah, but the strike of 2019, it never got off. People lost their jobs. You know, it was a mess from the beginning. We tried to call it 3 weeks before we wanted to do it. Again, it needs to have more meat to it than that, and people need to have a cognizance of the risk, because it is going to be risky, and the workers need to have real agency. It's like, is this something we want to do individually in cases of non-unionized workers, but collectively in terms of trade unions, both the membership and the leadership structure.
Yeah, and in relation to that, what's your take on how best to define success or failure? Because there are those who look at the Winnipeg General strike itself as a failure, yeah. but as you've argued and as others have, you know, despite the specific nature of how it unfolded and ended, there are a lot of successes that still came out of it. So what would a success or failure look like today, do you think?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, the argument from the strike, the initial kind of historical take by people like, the name is slipping around, Berkison, David Berkison. The argument for him and some others was that the strike failed because the actual core demands weren't met. The strike leaders were locked up. People kind of slinked back to the work. Some people got deported. Many people couldn't get jobs when they went back because they were blackballed. You know, and that this was a defeat. Right, and it was a defeat because they shouldn't have called the general strike. They should have called, you know, more formalized labor strikes and what have you. Right. Others have argued, however, that the strike won because it created this movement. It won because out of that strike, a lot of the leadership ended up forming political careers and transformed both Winnipeg, Manitoba, and federal politics. J.S. Wordsworth said, when I was sent to, and J.S. Wordsworth, of course, was not ultimately given a sentence, but he was jailed. But Wordsworth said that when Meehan jailed me, he elected me to Parliament. Right? Some of these workers were elected to legislatures and Parliament from prison. So in a sense, it created labor martyrs amongst what would become largely the CCF, but not exclusively the CCF, because this is really the origin of, say, Winnipeg's relatively unique kind of history of communist politics at the local level, which is where the Penner tradition comes from, which is why Norman Penner and his father being involved in the strike and being a politician in the 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in the city was so important. It all comes from this. So you could say from the political side of electoral politics, whether it's the communists or the CCF, that those movements grew out of this. It grew out of this moment. You could also say that a lot of people argue that this was the first step of industrial unionism in Canada. You know, craft unionism being that old way of you have a union for butchers, a union for bakers, a union for candlestick makers, right? And you have 16, I'm not exaggerating, 16 to 18, depending on the time and definition, different railway unions, each representing workers on the railways, at least on the international side, with the only industrial major union in Canada at the time being the Canadian Brotherhood of Railway Employees. And they were, in fact, they were often ostracized for it, because it was seen that, like, why are you wasting time organizing the riffraff? We've got to focus on the skilled tradesmen. That's who needs to be in unions. But the Winnipeg General Strike was driven in part by this concept that it's a class thing. Everyone's going out, you know, or the vast majority of people are going out. And there are some people who draw the line saying that although Canada's industrial unionism, the modern one, actually the epicenter is in southern Ontario, in places like Windsor and Oshawa, what have you, that the spirit of Winnipeg and of the general strike wave across Canada led into that movement, right? It also ties into kind of other concepts too, that strikes aren't always about achieving objectives, but about building kind of narratives, right? Similar lines are made about the asbestos strike in Quebec. The 1949 asbestos strike, that's largely a defeat. The police, Maurice Duplessis, the company, they largely crushed the strikers. You know, they wanted recognition, they wanted protection from the asbestos dust, they wanted, you know, relatively modest wage increases relative to the time, and they lost. But the strike became part of mythology, part of the first domino in the collapse of Maurice Duplessis and the birth of a modern Quebec. And whether that mythology is strictly true or not is sometimes irrelevant, because the Winnipeg General Strike has value because people thought they won. And the argument that Penner makes in his original foreword to this book, because the book is largely written by the strikers themselves, but his kind of introduction to it, he says that, you know, we're lucky that the strikers didn't see this as a loss, because we wouldn't have this as an inspiration. So they themselves at the time didn't feel they had lost. They felt that, like, you know, it was a battle deferred, but that they had won the sympathetic battle. And, you know, this, you know, transformed their discourse. I mean, Mackenzie King actually felt that this was the reason he became the Liberal leader, because, you know, whether, you know, King being, you know, not necessarily pro-labor, King having this deep labor experience was so key, because the old political parties even were shook by the experience of Winnipeg and the reaction nationally to the Winnipeg General Strike, that they felt they had to address it. And King was seen as a solution, because King for so long had been a pioneer in industrial relations as a practice, but also as an academic discipline, as a study. And so it's really key. And there's other things too, like after the strike, all these elections happen. Abraham Heaps, who would also be, would be kind of founder of the CCF, with part of the Labour Party, along with William Irvine and J.S. Wordsworth. They would often be like the three-person Labour Party caucus. He gave a speech a few weeks after the strike at Queen's Park, and I believe there was 5,000, 10,000. It's mentioned in the book. 10,000 people out to come hear them talk. It's very clear that this wasn't a defeat. When one of the strikers finished his prison sentence, he went back to Vancouver, and while in Vancouver there was I think 10,000 people waiting for him at the train station to welcome him. So people didn't see this as a loss, and I think that sometimes matters more than whether it is or not. In terms of what that means today, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what that means today. Does that mean that you're getting Ford to back down on some of his policies? In some ways, you've already been seeing that. The one bright side of the Ford versus Harris years is that one, Ford doesn't have a mandate that Harris did. Ford largely lied to voters. Ford, he largely won because he lied. Because Ford, people often call him stupid. He's uncultured, but he's rather shrewd. Ford looked at what Tim Hudak did in 2014, which is be honest with the voters, whether we find his honesty appealing or not. He said, I'm going to fire 100,000 of you. Voters didn't like that. So Ford said, I'm going to fire no one. I'm going to fire no one. We all knew, I think most of us in this room knew he was lying, but it didn't matter because the way our system works is there's no redos, there's no recalls. We get a 4 or 5 year, parliamentary dictatorship. The downside to that, though, is that there's a lot of Ford voters that aren't happy. There's a lot of PC ridings that were relatively close in their votes, and so public pressure has made moves. There's been a partial back down on the teacher firings. There's been partial back downs on the autism funding reduction. There's been partial back downs on the green belt being opened, and so on and so on. So these public protests can have a value there. They can also have a value in capacity building, I think is important, is you're energizing people. You're creating activists, especially amongst young people. If we've been seeing, it's really been the young people, younger than myself, like I'm in my early 30s, but I'm talking about like teenagers and younger people who have been doing this stuff, not just with the Ford government, with the Trudeau government. There was, of course, the recent student protests in here, but also a couple years ago in Quebec. Just a few weeks ago, there was the Daughters of the Vote protesting both Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer, because they both deserve it, for their betrayal of either Indigenous people or young people or both. And there was also the protest of Justin Trudeau a few years ago here in Ottawa at the Young Workers Summit, where he was invited without the consent of the young workers in the group. The CLC leadership thought it would be good to have Justin Trudeau, and not for, say, someone like Nikki Ashton or Mike Palasek, who at the time was the CUPW president and was under the age of 35 at the time. So they invited Justin Trudeau. A good chunk of the young workers in the room responded by turning their backs to him. And in a sense, then it was the young people are kind of showing us the way. And there is the potential that if you can intertwine the energies of a general strike in terms of workers, it could, for instance, be linked to these student movement protests, and that could have a great potential to build as these people go into workplaces and as they go into, as they continue to vote and as they continue to become more engaged citizens. And I think that's a potential value. And whether that manifests in stronger unions or whether that manifests in more progressive governments, that could be a kind of longer-term victory, even if, let's say, the goal of the general strike is, let's say, we want to actually collapse this government. That's unlikely, right?
And one last question, and then we'll open it up to some discussion with everyone here. You talked about the significance of the strikers writing their history in their own words, and you're a labor historian, and we've seen, as you mentioned, that in the book, the workers' own documentation is the basis of the book, and largely responsible for the bulk of what we know about the strike today. So with that in mind, what's your takeaway on the importance of workers documenting our own history and struggles in relation to the creation of this book, of course, but the implications of that for our working class struggles in general?
No, certainly. I think it's incredibly important that labor history continue to be a priority within the academy, but perhaps more so that workers themselves, either as individuals or as organizations, have a kind of historical mindset, that they think historically. And I think, for instance, one of the reasons why a lot of people were duped by Justin Trudeau is because they lost a historical mindset. They didn't even remember Paul Martin, let alone Jean Chrétien or Pierre Trudeau, and the deep attacks on labor and what have you. So having a historical mindset is very important, and that could be done through the need to teach more history at the university and public school level, of course, but through unions themselves, intertwining history within their education systems. They could be doing that more. Of course, I know that they do offer those connections. That's one option. Unions themselves, I think, need to be mindful of how they document their history. One thing now, I think, is that because we have so much information, people often think it's disposable. But I think unions should have to look at policies internally about document keeping emails. I know there are privacy concerns, but frankly, I think that every email sent by, say, a CLC president, every email by labor council leaders, those things should be saved. Maybe not to be released for many, many years, of course, but we should, be sure to have systems to document as much information as we can. Because, when I study labor unions in the 30s, or even into the 70s when telephones existed, I have lots of letters to look at. Lots of letters, lots of newspapers, things like that. Nowadays, there's not a lot of physical paper, relative, right? We have pamphlets and posters, and those are great, and and those are valuable. But the CLC president isn't sending physical letters to the Saskatchewan Fed and talking about issues that are going to be historically important 30, 40 years from now. It's all on email. Unions have websites, which have a lot of great information on them, but what happens when websites stale out? We're not preserving websites. There's not a concerted effort amongst the labor movement to archive its own digital and physical information, both its public digital information, but also its private digital information, like email correspondences and things like that. That's extremely important. And again, I know there are privacy concerns and what have you, but there's no reason to say that emails sent out by elected officials of major unions and of major federations shouldn't be put onto kind of an encrypted server to be released 50 years hence or something, which would protect obviously issues of confidentiality and what have you, but would allow future researchers, both lay researchers but also academics, from finding value in that. So I think that's extremely important. And I think workers doing their own history is important because academic history has a definitive value. Biased as I am, there are certain ways in which we do academic history which are incredibly inefficient and inaccessible, but actually do have a lot of value because it's like a medical journal in a way. It's not really for mass consumption, but the people who read it derive real value, and it does influence how we do pedagogy and understand things. But for the most part, I think it's very important that that workers write their own history because the perspective matters. And much like how a man can write women's history, women understand their history more innately. They have it as a lived experience, and they have it as a shared experience, and they have the ability to empathize in a different way. So I would say much the same thing. Working class people understand not only their own history, but the own context and how that history's evolved and things like that. So I'm excited to see, and I'm hopeful to see a lot of that. And I think there's a great opportunity now because the boomer generation is starting to retire, right? And a lot of these workers, I'd love to see histories from these workers. You're seeing some. You're seeing histories from people like Sid Ryan, who's written his own history. But I'd love to see workers of a more rank and file level find ways of writing their history, of sharing their memoirs, of sharing their experiences. And while that might not be through book, not everyone might have the inclination or the ability to publish a book. They might have the ability to share things of that sort. So that could be a good opportunity to conduct oral history interviews and things like that. I know PIPS. Anybody here a PIPS member? No? PIPS is doing a institutional history of their organization as it approaches the 50th anniversary, and they're working with an academic historian to do it. And one of the things they have is they have a whole bunch of archives, but they also have conducted oral history interviews. So unions themselves should talk to members, talk to retirees and stuff, and record this information because it has immense value to understanding not only the workplace, but the internal union politics that exist, which is something that we would often lose because, again, not everyone has formal spaces where they've written and contributed. Not everyone has held an office that allows them to have this formalized voice, but we all have important experiences. So oral history is a great tool with for any academic discipline, and it's really growing the importance of oral history. But I think I can't think of a group maybe better than working class history, except for maybe Indigenous history, that would benefit so richly from oral history specifically, both done within the academy, but also by the institutions themselves.
Yeah, definitely, and certainly worth all of us here and those watching to consider, since We do also have some great working class media publications like Rank and File and Our Times and others. There are platforms there that we can use collectively to write our histories as well. So thanks for all of that. And I want to open it up if there are any questions or things folks want to add to the conversation in relation to the general strike, the role of arts and culture in advancing the struggle, the large volume of insights we've heard today. Anyone want to kick us off? Yeah, go ahead.
So I found very interesting what you're talking about with the the Citizens Committee of 1,000 and the way that they, I mean, in a way, it seems like, especially with firing the police, bringing in the specials, kind of almost substituted themselves for the formal bourgeois state.
Yes.
And you talked about how the strike itself sort of inserted itself into this like global context of the Russian Revolution, German Revolution, all these uprisings that were going on. Do you think there might also be parallels between like the Citizens Committee of 1,000 and the specials and the way that they kind of like tried to suppress the strike with just like naked force, and the rise of like the black shirts in Italy, the Freikorps in Germany, like other sort of fascist or proto-fascist organizations?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, we don't know in part because they were successful, and whereas in Germany, I think that the left movements were perhaps broader. You don't forget Canada. The limitation of Canada's working class at the time is Canada is still largely agricultural across the country, but especially in the West even. There are big cities like Winnipeg, and there are growing cities like Calgary and Edmonton, but basically from Toronto to Vancouver, it's largely agricultural space or primary resource extraction space, which are good for unionization, but often isolated in a sense. If you're in a rural timber camp or if you're in a rural mining community, right? But I could see some of the logic, which is that when, like the capitalists, or like, when the state fails, which is what happened in Germany, which is what happened in Italy, which is what happened in a lot of the countries where fascism rose, you often see fascism take root in the ability to kind of convince the middle classes that their interests are with against democracy, in a sense. So I could certainly see, elements of Winnipeg's middle class did go with the constituted, capitalist authority, whether it's because they thought it was their class interest or because they bought into the narrative of defending British democracy. Mm-hmm. I could certainly see that playing a role. Ultimately, would that have played into, fascism itself? It's tricky because it's only the local authority that really gets substituted. Because it's the city structures of government largely disappear. But this is largely endorsed by both the provincial and federal governments, and is underpinned. The specials are important, but it's also the RCMP, right? And so in a sense, I think in Italy and Germany, because those countries, especially they don't have Italy doesn't have the strict federated structure that Canada does. I think there was a more total failure there. Well, the general strike wave was national in Canada. It wasn't just in Winnipeg, and it wasn't just in the West. This wasn't a total collapse of constituted authority where the Manufacturers Association supplanted, say, the federal government and did this. It's different in that sense. It's more localized. So I don't know if it ever had a chance to develop into that. But you raise interesting points, of whether it's that or whether it's the business plot to try to overthrow FDR in the United States. That was somewhat myth, but also somewhat fact. You could have had an alternative history where, if it came down to it, part of Canada's middle class and elite would have sided with fascism over liberal democracy if it was to stop socialism. But I mean, that's also hypothetical too, right? So
yeah. Other questions or comments?
I have a dim memory of when I was a young person in Montreal. I thought it was like 72 that there was a general strike. I mean, I remember my CEGEP was on strike. Everybody seemed to be on strike. Can you comment on that?
Well, Montreal was a point of labor radicalism in general in the 60s and 70s. There was a police strike in 1969, I believe. There was a heavy strike wave. I don't know if there was a general strike in Montreal, but there were a lot of strikes. The closest thing to a modern general strike in Canada would have been in 1976, which was during wage and price controls. So Pierre Trudeau in 1974 gets elected on a promise to not implement wage and price controls. He wins largely by taking NDP votes away from David Lewis, basically a strategic gambit to stop the Tories. That works, but Justin Trudeau, or Pierre Trudeau again, there's a lot of similarities, and I've written a book on one. But what happens there is that he reneges on that promise, implements wage and price controls, and in a manner that's nakedly pro-capital, because prices could not be controlled in any effective manner, but wages certainly could. So there is about 1 million workers go on strike in Canada in 1976, but it's only one day. It's only a one-day strike, but it is a strike. It's not, May Day. Often people will have protests or will have rallies. It was people went out of work, 1 million people. Some of them were non-union, largely through the CLC. Most of the affiliates participated. Not all of them did, and that was 1 million people went on strike on that day. That was the closest thing to a general strike. There were relatively few reprimands for it. There were some locals where people got fired, but there was a lot of protesting about workers who were punished. And largely in that sense, that would probably be the closest thing to like a modern general strike.
There were the 3 leaders in Quebec,
Yeah.
the teachers, the FLQ, and I think the CSN that were all jailed.
Was it a general strike? It was, okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And not only that, but what's interesting about it is that there was an ongoing kind of dispute between the unions and the government.
Yeah.
And union leaders were arrested
Yeah.
and jailed,
Yeah.
which prompted an illegal mass strike across the province.
Yeah.
And in fact, the government had to cut a deal with the imprisoned union leaders in order to get people back to work.
Yeah.
And in some parts of Quebec, like Sept-Îles, for example, you see people beginning to take really interesting actions, occupying the local radio station and beginning to broadcast news about the strike and so on. So it's both longer and more radical than the event that occurs in 1976.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the specific history about because what ends up happening is that at the time, there were a wildcat wave, and often union leaders were punished. The truth is, sometimes the heads of these unions weren't the ones making the decisions. This was a time of headaches for both governments and employers, but also union leaders, because these were driven by a lot of this was the boomer generation coming to the workforce, having very high expectations, not having the same kind of conceptions that the old union leaders did, and they often went on wildcat strikes in places like Quebec as well. And this is really interesting because the workers were jailed, and you see a similar pattern in 1979 where the postal workers are about to go on strike. They're legislated back basically the day of the announcement, but not all the workers go back. Jean-Claude Parot is ultimately arrested on it. Whether or not he was actually defying it or not, he was. I think he was in jail. I don't know, 6 months, 3 months. So you got a pretty lengthy sentence for civil disobedience, effectively. But
defying an act of Parliament.
Yeah.
That's all we got.
Yeah. So it was very interesting in that sense, right? But 1972 is very, very interesting. And I think that's tied into a general re-emergence of the left in Canada, and this manifests in the growth of the Bloc, and it manifests in the fact that the NDP in the 1970s kind of reverts back from the cautiousness of the 50s and 60s and does become more radical again, and it's being driven in part by these kind of social and economic movements that are really shaking things up. And again, it's a headache for the traditional union leaders. And this is a thing in Winnipeg too. A lot of labor leaders at the local and regional level certainly supported the strike, but there were a lot of Trades and Labor Congress leaders in Ottawa that were not happy with the general strike, either the strike in general or especially how it was done. Even the guy I'm doing a biography on right now, A.R. Mosher, who's the head of the Brotherhood of Railway Employees, didn't oppose the strike, but really didn't like the fact that the workers in Winnipeg did it without his permission. He really just wanted that telegram, right? So like, so there was a lot of this tension, right? Because you're shaking things up not only in how the state and in capital, but the unions themselves were being transformed by these actions, because it was workers at the local level doing things a little bit differently. And I think in Montreal that's certainly the case, especially when you're talking about the federalized unions, because they were dealing with provincial politics, but this was having a national effect. The conception of the Montreal strikes, yeah.
Yeah, and in relation to that, what we're seeing in the current Ontario context is what seems to be an increasing escalation that could well be coming to a head in the coming months between the government and teachers and education workers, and we've seen the whole Red for Ed organizing in the States, where there's been significant successful pushback by teachers and educators there, and it sort of gets back to what you were talking about earlier about the need to organize beyond just the traditional unionized structures in the movement, but like looking at what the Chicago's teachers union does, for example, around community organizing, and sort of given the context and how things are really escalating here with the attacks on education workers and educational institutions. What do you think are some of the lessons, both from the strike and some of the organizing with educators in the States that's happening?
Yeah, I think strikes are a public relations exercise too. Like, they're going to cause inconvenience. They're going to have to, right? But like the postal workers strike, the way in which they do it, one, it protects them legally. I think that the violation of the right to strike was unconstitutional. I trust the courts will actually find in their favor, but we won't find out for years. But it's in part the reason why the postal workers can strike constitutionally, I feel, is because they put provisions in to mitigate the effects. Medications still get delivered, EI checks still get delivered, basic things like that. I don't know, does anybody know, did letters to Santa still get delivered? Like, I don't know. Like all the necessities got delivered. Letters to Santa, all of these things makes it so that so people aren't going to be mad at you, one, and it protects you from, it gives the government less legitimacy, whether or not they care is one thing, to actually clamp down on you. And the Winnipeg General Strike had some of this. The Winnipeg General Strike was it shut down the city, but again, the police were willing to go on strike, but they were asked not to because they realized that would look bad, and that they felt that there was value in having a police force to keep things relatively ordered. There was that sense, there was a trust in the local police, if not the RCMP. But also, things like bread and milk still got delivered. The famous strike cards, by the authority of the strikers, the Winnipeg Strike Leadership Committee, you are allowed to go and deliver your bread and milk and eggs, as those things used to get delivered to your house, right? And they were allowed to do that, and that was a threat to capital. Capital hated that because it was these workers actually determining who could go where and what. They were in a sense taking over authority. When we say whose streets are streets, we say that as a chant. But they literally controlled access to many of the streets, right? And so in doing that, you assert your authority, but you make it so that you're not actively harming people that are probably aimed to be on your side or at least are neutral, and you don't want to tip them over the edge to the other side. And I think that strikes today and labor organizing today needs to have that as a mindset. And public unions are probably should be especially attuned to this, given that they have a role as serving the public. So I think educational workers building these community ties, tying in their struggle not only to their own wages, but to funding cuts, tying it in with things like library cuts, I think is important. Even though those are different, it's more of a QP thing. But tying in library cuts to education cuts to these sorts of things is extremely important, and I think is tactically astute. One of the challenges, you bring up the strikes in the United States, one of the double-edged swords of trade unionism is that in some ways, what's been happening in a lot of right-to-work red states would be impossible in Canada, because our unions have structures that give them legal responsibilities. Unions can be fined. Labor leaders could, hypothetically, if the laws, could be jailed. Collective bargaining agreements can be torn up. Yet if you're a teacher in a non-union state, when they wildcatted, sure, I guess they could be fired. Somebody could have tried a Reagan and replaced all the teachers like they did the air traffic controllers, but they didn't. those teachers were all, none of those teachers in some of those states are actually prohibited from unionizing. And yet they just struck anyway, and they won. The thing is that the union gives great power, but it also can create difficulties in that. So I think that's why hybrid models that organize both amongst formalized trade unions, but that seek to mobilize people who are both non-union environments. But as we see in Winnipeg even, some of the strikers were unemployed, and as we saw in the Great Depression, one of the things that most formal unions failed at, but what the communists especially were good at, was organizing unemployed workers, saying working class people aren't just people who at this moment are being paid, but are actively part of this class. And tying into that further is that, you know, it's a social thing. You have to make it fun in a sense. You have to make it, and one of the things with the Winnipeg General Strike is they had events for kids. While a lot of women workers themselves went on strike, the first people to go on strike were the women who worked at the phone dispatch. We need the phone operators. Yeah, they were the first ones to go on strike, kind of in the morning, like the early morning of the strike. They went out. But because most women at the time, you know, they were housewives, or a lot of them were housewives, a lot of those women took roles in the strike in terms of cooking food, childcare, all of that essential social labor that allowed the strike to continue. And I think in our modern times, that labor needs to be done. If there really is going to be a general strike, and that's obviously going to affect schools and things like that, children being taken care of, children still being taught in some manners, that's all going to be very important. Food needs to be cooked, things like that need to happen. The poorest workers, who certainly won't have savings, need to have something to help take care of them. Strike funds will need to be collectivized in certain senses. All of these things need to happen. And even during the Winnipeg General Strike, there were lectures, there were talks about socialism and how to go forward, stuff that didn't even have anything to do with the strike itself in the immediate term, but were part of the experience. And I think that that's something that that would need to be heeded, I think, in our own time. And you know, to make the strike more engaging and fun and less antagonistic to parties that are sort of kind of quote unquote bystanders. Yeah.
Yeah, in the back there, and then.
What do you think about some of the groundwork that was done by teachers' unions in the States, sort of between these labor events? You know, I know that a lot of sort of public outreach was done in Chicago and other places. And it's something I've been trying. I'm a teacher. I'm trying to interest my own union in community outreach. You know, on the level of what the Black Panthers used to do in the States. You know, so you know, if the state can't feed its children, maybe we should be doing that. You know, go out with the breakfast program, banner with the union. You know, so we insert ourselves in the public life. So that when the time comes for these crisis moments, that the public's already had a lot of groundwork in you know, identifying with us and not seeing us as kind of like a kind of a cloistered interest group. What kinds of work do you think we can do in the meantime?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be done in the meantime, because it's like, you know, you want credibility, right? You want credibility with people. I mean, this is the whole reason. I think, like, this is the whole reason why people, like in the States, whether or not he's as left-wing as he is, like, people love Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders has had these views even before the views were popular, right? And so unions, in the same sense, need to be in these communities before they need the support of those communities. Otherwise, it will likely look self-serving, and people will see through that. I think one thing we have to do in Canada is we need to reach out to diverse communities, right? Because there are communities with relatively low union rates. We need to reach out to these communities in the languages of those communities with people, if at all possible, from those communities. And this is actually one thing. I was at an OFL event a few years ago in the context of the run-up to the federal election, the 2015 election. And they said that the party by far most effective at reaching out to non-white communities with the Conservative Party, because they were adept and it's also because they were in the government. The government has resources where they can spend them more effectively than opposition parties. But they published articles in Urdu, in Cantonese, in Mandarin, in all sorts of languages that you know besides the official two languages, and put sources in those communities. So it wasn't just about running a Chinese Canadian in a predominantly Chinese Canadian riding. That's certainly important, but it was about building those community ties, going to those ethnic newspapers, the foreign language press, if you will, the domestic language press, these neighborhood associations who always need content, who always need advertising. They need it, right? We know a lot of people here, maybe you're involved, whether it's like a labor magazine or something, you're starved for advertising and for content at time, and the conservatives gave it to them. And I think labor, in a sense, needs to do more, even more, to organize in these communities, both to organize workers, but to build these ties. Because if there is a general strike, or if there is a major strike of teachers, they need to have support in those communities. Other things is that, in terms of these charitable work, I think that's extremely important. Unions do a lot of that already, though, so I wonder how they can effectively do it. I mean, unions do, most every union has some kind of charitable function, usually one that's also outward looking. Whether I was for a long time a member of the PSAC when I was a grad student, they had the Solidarity Fund. I know the steel workers have a Humanity Fund. I know lots of unions have these funds that in various ways invest money globally, whether it's to help unions themselves in developing countries or whether it's to address workers' issues or what have you. And I know they have charitable groups. I know my wife is a member of the Steelworkers, and whenever they have a convention, what they normally do is they combine a local charitable component. So they'll, for instance, do a park cleanup in the community, or they'll have an event for children in the community. They intertwine themselves within a local organization. But I don't know if that's systemic, right? And I don't know if that's like that. I don't know necessarily what the solution is. This could be a great role for labor councils, I think. I think labor councils would be a good role for this, because labor councils bring together a lot of different unions. They're more likely to have a diverse experience because you're bringing together people from a room. Labor councils already have the goal of political action, but political action need not be purely defined by electoral politics. Although I do think electoral politics is extremely important, and labor should be, I think, even more involved in electoral politics, and biased as I am in a certain partisan manner. And not in an ABC manner, but the reality is that politics is also local relations. Politics is also neighborhood to neighborhood discussion, and I think that could be determined to be the action of labor councils would be a great tool there. How can we become pillars of the community? And that could be something to look at. And I don't know if that's going to be a question of resources. Are local unions willing to pony up a bit extra more money to do it? Are volunteers willing to do that work? I don't know, but it's something to look at. And it's good because, not every community has a labor council, but a lot of them do, and they would understand the specific challenges and concerns of their community, at least better than, a broad movement by the CLC or by the OFL, or even a national affiliate, but located in, say, Ottawa, the PSAC in Ottawa, try to determine what PSAC workers in Halifax think are local concerns, right?
Hey, Chris, and then Brad.
Yeah, two things. One, I'd recommend the movie We Are Wisconsin for people that are looking at how to integrate the traditional labor structure organizing with community organizing. Because what they did prior, they knew it was going to be a sustained occupation, actually. And they started to set up duty rosters so that people were buying collectively groceries, people were doing collective childcare. And this was stuff that they started to organize way in advance, right? And if you go outside of privileged Canada and look at how organizing is done in a lot of other countries and very frontier kinds of places, it's not planning, this is how they survive day to day, of course, right? Is through collective action and coordinating their resources. So that would be one way I would encourage you, but the movie is also terrific, and it's really empowering, and it will stir you. Now, I guess my question really comes back to the Citizens 1000, because as you were articulating it, it made me think an awful lot of the collusion, of course, that was highlighted for a lot of Canadians with our formal political structures and corporations through the SNC-Lavalin affair. But what we struggle with here in Ottawa, of course, is the collusion of developers and decisions made by our politicians around how our resources, our land resources, our financial resources, our transportation resources are being used. Can you articulate or extrapolate any further of how the strikers actually actively started to confront the Capitol beyond the physical confrontation? Like, was there anything after the strike was over that continued to hold Capitol accountable for what happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, in general, after this point, you do see the rise of political movements at local levels in cities like Hamilton and Winnipeg and Toronto, like left-wing, either communist or democratic socialist, sometimes a combination of the two, would find elections. In terms of combating it, you would see, you know, a mixture of the continued role of collective bargaining, fighting for things in the workplace, but also workers within within formal electoral politics, pushing for better elections, things like that. And in terms of developers, even creating public space was important. Often, one of the criticisms of modern social democracy is that it's not wrestling with the fundamental ownership of the means of production, and I would agree. But in creating public spaces, as was done in the 40s and 50s and 60s, as a kind of left-wing initiative, you effectively challenge the role of capital, at least in certain parts. And I think one key aspect is housing is going to be a key fight. As you know, developers, I'm from Kingston, I've lived there for about 10 years. Kingston is a small city, but Kingston has a rental vacancy. Matthew, you were a long time Kingston. It's like 0.5%. Basically, 99.5 of every 100 rental units are full at any given time. So that's an incredibly advantageous situation for landlords. And the way municipal politics works in Kingston is Liberals and Conservatives are the developer party, largely NDP, to a lesser extent Greens are the everyone else party in a sense. And it's a real challenge because we have to deal with a couple factors, I feel. One is that we need to broaden our horizons again to talk not just about inclusive development, but like actual public and cooperative housing. Like just building housing that isn't market rate. Like not like, oh, this is like set at the poverty line, so this $1,400 a month apartment is technically affordable. No, like actual like housing built for people to live in and not as a speculative property. One of the challenges with that, however, unlike in the days of Winnipeg, is that a lot of working people own their homes, right? A lot of working people. Not as many as maybe would like, but in a lot of working people own property now, and one of the challenges is that we have to wrestle with that difficulty. I think, for instance, in Kingston, you might think that development is always very tricky because there are anti-development people in a general sense, like NIMBYist type people who, whether it's social housing or whether it's a private condo development, they want nothing built. Or you have people who, in a sense, feel their interests are with the developers. As long as the supply of housing is low, that house that they own could always be rented out or could be sold at an increased value. So we have to deal with these sorts of things. I think we have to reinvigorate a public spirit in our discourse. Unions need to go off the defensive. It's been a long time, and especially when unions back the Liberal Party, but it's been a long time that we've actually been talking about expanding programs. Right? We've been on defensive. This is why, again, complications aside, limitations aside, the recent Ontario NDP campaign was inspiring to a lot of people. It's because we're going to create dental care, we're going to create child care, we're literally there was another dental, pharmacare, dental care, and child care were all going to be made public programs. And that was a fundamental kind of shift away from the neoliberal era. So one of the things we need to see is if we're going to challenge developers or capital, is we got to take things out of the private sector. We just have to take more and more of the economy out of the private sector. Does that mean that we shouldn't have any private sector? I mean, I don't know. But I think that if something is already effectively publicly owned, like Bombardier or SNC, it's already effectively indebted to the public through subsidies and through contracts, or if it's oligopolistic or monopolistic in nature, or if it deals with fundamental necessities and inelastic demand, it should probably be controlled or at least heavily regulated by the public. And I think housing is one of those things, right? So, and I think that you could challenge developers. So on a local level, I think developers are a key cog in regressiveness. and I think that public housing is a good alternative to them. Not to say that you're going to ban private development, but that if you build, public development as an alternative to private capital at the local level, that's a key fight. Because I know in Kingston, that's the developer class. We don't have like an oil refinery in Kingston, where like our capitalist class is centered in the extractive industry. Our capitalist class is centered in landlords largely. Even small businesses are beholden to them, frankly. Not to romanticize the mom and pops, but like the mom and pops in Kingston pay square footage wise what you would in downtown Toronto in downtown Kingston. So they're being squeezed by the landlord class as well, and there are opportunities for alliances there. So I think like fighting landlords is key. And this was a big thing in the 20s actually. A lot of activism was basically, a lot of people were getting evicted, be it from farms or be it from their apartments or from their houses. The banks were taking their homes or landlords were kicking them out because they lost their jobs. People just didn't leave. They had protests, they just didn't leave. We've even seen rent strikes. In Toronto, there was there one in Ottawa as well? But there was one. I know there was one. Anyway, I think it was successful. The landlord was a crappy landlord. They didn't fix stuff. The rents were high, and they weren't getting any services for what they were paying for. So they just stopped paying their rent, and they dared them to evict them, and they got the improvements. I don't know if they got all they sought, but they got significant improvements because they withheld their rent. And I think that's key because we talk about strikes as, again, withholding labor, and I think that's still probably the primary form of striking is people withholding their labor, but there are other ways you can strike as well, which is, instead of withholding your rent, and I think that's a kind of way of potentially striking.
Right. Yeah, thanks so much. You talked about so many things and touched on so many points, a really rich discussion. A couple of things I wanted to say. First of all, my friend back here, I think one of the other lessons of the teacher strikes in the United States, and you're absolutely right to point out that these were not exclusively, but in many cases, strikes by non-union teachers, is that well in advance of those strikes, the teachers actually recognized and prepared how to deal with various kinds of community realities. So when you look at some of the videos from people who organized the strikes in West Virginia, for example, they talk about the importance of making sure that kids who were getting fed in the schools would continue to be fed. So in that respect, they're framing their whole struggle not just as a struggle by relatively privileged or wealthy teachers, but by the community against the government. I think that that's something that all unions have to keep in mind now when they're bargaining, to take into consideration ways in which they might be able to craft demands that are in the public interest, for the public good. And that allows them to have a way to counter some of the normal bullshit that they get from employers and from governments during the context of strike situations. I wanted to just touch for a second on the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike here in Ottawa. Because of course there were general strikes across the country, some largely inspired by what had gone on in Winnipeg, many of them motivated by the fact that the conditions locally were the same or very similar as what they were in Winnipeg. In the spring and early summer of 1919, Ottawa came very close to having a sympathetic general strike. And in fact, there was an ongoing battle in the labor movement locally between the left and the right. A strike was, there were a number of strikes, local strikes. A key one was a strike by the Ottawa Electric Railway workers, the people who ran the transit system. And as that was progressing, the radicals in the labor movement finally won the right to hold a vote about a general strike in the city. But before the strike vote could be held, the transitway workers conceded, and so the strike collapsed. But there are some really interesting lessons from the far more complex history that I've mentioned here that are worth knowing for people who are resident in this city. And similarly, just to back up a couple of decades before that, The largest strike in Canada in the 19th century was here in Ottawa in 1891, and it was a strike by sawmill workers, 3,500. And what's interesting about that strike is that it combined Anglophone workers, both Protestant and Catholic, which was a huge divide back then, along with Quebec-based French-Canadian sawmill workers. And it was a strike that was waged by non-union workers. It was built from the bottom up. It was dealt with by the mobilization of troops by the federal government to go out and defend the sawmills against the strikers and so on. It's filled with lessons for labor activists today. I just want two further points, quick ones. I think one of the key issues when we're trying to make sense of the lessons and the experience of 1919 for today is to recognize that there is, in a sense, a very serious break in the history of our movement, which occurs after World War II. Because at that point, the federal government takes the initiative to rework the entire nature of the relationship between capital and labor, and to create a legalized system of industrial relations, which in part, and it's more complex than this, but in part creates within the workers' movement a union leadership that now has a much more vested interest in maintaining the legal status quo. So we see after the 1940s that many of the most important strikes in Canadian history, for example, the 1965 postal workers strike that won the right for federal public servants to eventually be unionized, it's both a strike against the employer and a strike against their own union organization. And we see that recurring time after time after the 1940s. So that's a kind of a key moment, which means that we have to be careful about trying to transpose some of the lessons of 1919 into the circumstances of today, because the institutional structure for the working class struggle is quite different. And just a final point, I really appreciate your comments on the importance of memory and history, because one of the things that I'm involved in here is doing working class oriented tours about the history of class struggle, indigenous issues, and so on in the city. And I think that your comments about academic history are interesting. I think one of the things that's really important for all of us on the left is to recognize that we have to create our own institutions of commemoration and memory, and that we have to find ways to engage in the popular education that's required so that activists are more equipped to build the movements today that recognize some of the lessons of the past.
No, I agree.
So thanks a lot.
No, for sure. I mean, all fantastic points. I think one key thing you're right about the strike, because at the time, the West was rapidly growing. The towns in the West were very new, relative. Whereas, older cities in Eastern Canada had existed in some cases since the 16 and 1700s, both in, especially if you look at the epicenter of colonialism in Canada, really kicks off in the kind of Quebec City, Montreal corridor, but cities in the Maritimes and cities in southern Ontario are significantly older. The labor union leadership there was a bit more entrenched. Even the leadership out west was still relatively neophyte in its nature, which was why things were a bit easier to deal with out there. And much of Canada's labor leadership was located in Ottawa, specifically many of the traditional railway unions, because the railway being a federal jurisdiction, they are organized in Ottawa, but also the Trades and Labor Congress, which largely existed as a lobbying group, was centered here. And a lot of the Trades and Labor Congress leadership was at least skittish about the strike. There were real concerns from them about how, up until that point, they've been largely nonpartisan in their politics. They've lobbied governments, but they would at times, depending on the government, much like the AFL in the United States, would not really be for the Liberals or the Conservatives, although they would tend to be more liberal, but that wasn't always a guarantee. And I think that there was a feeling there. I understand what you're saying about the post-1940s labor unions, the status quo being more invested in, but there was a lot of labor leaders that had certain privileges, hard earned, hard won, hard fought for. Even these labor leaders, again, older leaders that remembered a time where even what they had then was what they could not have dreamt. The position of workers in the 1910s that existed in the 1870s or 1880s or 1890s, for instance, and they worried about losing it. They worried about losing it. So sometimes it is about, the rank and file pushing against an obstinate leadership, but sometimes it's a leadership that's scared of falling backwards, and I think it's a really interesting perspective. But it should also be noted that there were trade unionists that were opposed to the strike. Gideon Robertson was the Minister of Labor. He was a craft unionist from one of the railway brotherhoods. I think he was a telegrapher or what have you. I'm not sure of the specifics. And he was, in a sense, the Minister of Labor. He wasn't elected, but the conservative government, the union government at the time, put him, he was in the Senate, and they made him Minister of Labor because he was nominally a working man, and he became the face of the effort to crush the strike. And he was a union member. And I think that we see that the class conflict happens within the class as well about the nature of the strike and whether or not it should happen. But fantastic points, all of them.
And Bart.
I'm hoping I'm going to be last but not least. I'm on the board for the Workers' History Museum, and our mandate is to tell worker stories. And as you mentioned, unions aren't very good. They're really good at doing things, but they're not really good about talking about the wins that they've had and the successes. So we've done some of that. We did the PSAC 50th anniversary. We did a book and a video about them. We did one of the components, the Union of Taxation Employees. They hired us to do their 50th anniversary, all in 2016. So one of the things that we do and try and do are telling oral histories, because once the voice is gone, the memories are gone. And we need to get more and more oral histories and keep a record of them so that we do have them for the future, because a lot of the youth today figure that a lot of the benefits that we have were given to us because the government liked us. Knowing that that's not true, you got to make sure that they learn, and the way you do that is through documentaries and interesting things. I just wanted to say that I've enjoyed the talk, but we're also doing a storytelling event about the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike on May 13th, and it's with a storyteller from the Ottawa Storytellers. Her grandfather was actually involved in the strike.
Oh, that's
so this is going to be told from a family perspective, and he was her grandfather was one of the strike committee of 100 versus the capitalist 1,000, right? He was on the other side. And so she's going to tell the story, and then we'll have a panel discussion afterwards. And it's going to be at Center Point in the Chambers. It is a fundraising event for us because we are volunteers and don't have sustained funding, so we do events to try and generate some funding to keep us going during the year. So hopefully you'll get, I do have a blurb about it. I also wanted to say, when you mentioned about Jean-Claude Perron going to jail, he is a very fond member of our organization, and we are doing an evening with Jean-Claude in the fall. So keep an eye out for the Workers' History Museum for information about it. The date is still to be determined, but we will be talking, because it is the 40th anniversary of him ending up in jail. And his granddaughter is on the board with us, and he's quite active with us. So we're hoping that people will come out and do that. So thank you very much.
No,
thanks for that. And Bart just mentioned the storytelling event about the 1919 strike on May 13th. For more information, in addition to the handout, it is on the Mayworks program on the website at mayworksottawa.ca, so you can find out more about that and the full program of great events that we do have coming up over the next couple of weeks. In addition, we've got theater and dance and commemorations like that.
And
film too.
another event.
Yes, the film event.
We're doing an avant-premiere because our documentaries are usually done in both languages. We have the English finished on the 1935 onto Ottawa track, and so we're doing an event tomorrow night. It is tomorrow night.
Yeah, it is tomorrow night.
I forget what day I'm on. Tomorrow night at the Arts Court on Dairy Avenue. So 7 o'clock there will be, the video will be shown in English, and then there will be a panel discussion afterwards about the trek and its implications for today's life as well. So hopefully we'll see some of you. It is a free event, by the way.
Thanks for that, and I think we are going to have to wrap up because Christo does have a train to catch in not too long. But maybe and we can continue this discussion for those of you who are online. Feel free to add some comments on the Facebook page as well. Christo has a YouTube channel, so you can engage with this continuing discussion there as well. Just in closing, is there anything you want to highlight in terms of what we've talked about here and the general strike in general and its significance for today and organizing for the future?
Yeah, I think that it's really first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming on this Sunday. I know hope none of you personally are affected by the flooding. I hope that I know that's affecting many in the community here. So best wishes to those suffering from that. But the strike, I think it's important that we continue to talk about it, because again, for all the limitations of direct comparisons, because the legal context is different, the demographic context are different. We have new technologies now that, again, it make organizing easier in some ways, but harder in other ways. The point is we have to talk about it, because again, I think that it's an inspiring moment for us as a movement of trade unionists and of working class people and of leftists of various denominations. I think it gives us a hope that we can find ways of organizing beyond the union non-union divide. Although I don't think that should distract us from the fact that we should get everyone as much as we can to sign a union card. And I think it gives us this vision that there was a time not that long ago, and there were many cases after this, but there was a time where one of Canada's largest cities, the entire working class population, really tried to live otherwise, right? Try to challenge, the assumptions of capital and of private control of industry and private control of our streets, and the ultimate, they didn't agree on all the solutions. If they would have won that strike and taken over the city, there would have been a lot of fights between the working people of that city about the path forward. And we know the fights between unionists of various stripes and between communists and democratic socialists. We know all of that. We know the history there. We can talk about that till the cows come home. But the reality is they all wanted something fundamentally different, and they all realized in their hearts that society just wasn't fair. And I think the vast majority of people in Canada would probably agree with us. And so the challenge is how do we make that happen? How do we say, this is unfair, and we have the solution, right? We have the solution, whether it's collective action, whether it's talking about who ultimately owns the key levers of the economy, whether it's about talking about equity broadly defined and intersectional. All of these things really matter. That's the opportunity. A vast majority of Canadians are working people, and most Canadians, I think, would say that society just isn't plain fair, right? And I think that's our opportunity, to try to convince these people that we can have a fair society and that we have a solution to do it. And the lessons, in part, come from our history, like the Winnipeg General Strike.
Thanks so much. And just lastly, I do want to highlight the book we're talking about, Winnipeg in 1919, is available here. And thanks again to Octopus Books for co-sponsoring and getting the books here. And also, if you go to mayworksottawa.ca as well as the Facebook page, there's information there about how you can get the book. And for folks watching at home, you can check in with your local independent bookstore to get your hands on a copy. So thanks again, and would encourage everyone to participate in the other great Mayworks events coming up, and thanks to Christo for making the journey here.
Thanks,
and we'll see you all at the next upcoming events. Thanks, folks.